On August 11, 2025, the world's eyes remain fixed on Gaza, where a conflict that began nearly 2 years ago continues to devastate millions. At the heart of this crisis is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's controversial plan to permanently dismantle Hamas's military and governing capabilities, not to reoccupy Gaza, but to free it from Hamas's grip. As we examine the plan's military aims, humanitarian impact, and the global backlash, we confront a central question. Is Netanyahu's strategy achieving security, or is it steering the region toward deeper peril? Netanyahu's Gaza strategy is a multi-pronged campaign to reshape the territory's future. The first pillar, a full military seizure of Gaza City, aiming to eliminate Hamas's command centers, rocket arsenals, and tunnels. The second, total demilitarization, enforced by a long-term Israeli security presence and a buffer zone, with no role for the Palestinian Authority. Instead, the plan proposes a new local civilian administration. Gazan figures unaffiliated with Hamas or the PA, though critics doubt such leaders could be seen as legitimate. Designated safe zones for civilians have drawn intense criticism, as aid groups warn these areas are overcrowded, under-resourced, and unsafe. The reality, no part of Gaza is truly safe, and the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands has only deepened the humanitarian disaster. The world's response to Netanyahu's Gaza plan has been swift, unified, and overwhelmingly negative. Within hours of the announcement, leaders from every continent voiced their alarm, warning of dire consequences for both the region and the world. The plan has triggered a wave of urgent diplomatic activity, with governments scrambling to issue statements, convene emergency meetings, and coordinate their positions. The United Nations and its agencies have sounded the alarm, warning of mass starvation, further displacement, and a deepening humanitarian crisis. UN officials have called the plan a dangerous escalation that could push Gaza's already desperate population past the breaking point. Aid agencies on the ground are struggling to keep up with the growing needs as food, water, and medical supplies run dangerously low. Western allies, including the UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, have issued a rare joint statement, urging Israel to reverse course and warning that continued military action will only fuel instability. These countries, long seen as Israel's closest partners, are now openly questioning the wisdom and morality of the current approach. In a significant policy shift, Germany and the Netherlands have suspended military exports to Israel, citing concerns over civilian casualties and violations of international law. This move marks a dramatic departure from their previous support and signals growing unease within Europe about the direction of Israeli policy. Arab states, including regional heavyweights Saudi Arabia and Egypt, have condemned the plan in the strongest terms, describing it as a humanitarian catastrophe in the making. Their statements reflect deep anger and frustration, not only with the immediate crisis, but with the broader lack of progress toward a just solution. These nations have reiterated that any hope for normalization with Israel is impossible without a credible path to Palestinian statehood. The message is clear. Peace and recognition are off the table until the rights and aspirations of the Palestinian people are addressed. Even traditional allies like Canada and France are now threatening to formally recognize Palestinian statehood if Israel proceeds with its current strategy. This represents a major diplomatic shift and puts additional pressure on Israel to reconsider its actions. Around the world, images of destroyed neighborhoods and suffering civilians have sparked massive protests and calls for accountability. The message from the international community is unmistakable. The military approach is seen as reckless, deepening the conflict and making the prospect of peace more distant than ever. As global momentum shifts toward recognizing Palestinian rights, Israel finds itself more isolated than ever before. The chorus of condemnation grows louder, signaling a turning point in international attitudes and raising urgent questions about the future of the conflict. The human cost in Gaza is staggering. Over 61,000 Palestinians have lost their lives, the overwhelming majority of them civilians. Among the dead are thousands of children, whose lives were cut short in the most brutal of circumstances. Every day, families are torn apart by relentless airstrikes, and the grief is palpable in the streets, hospitals, and makeshift morgues. The scale of loss is almost impossible to comprehend, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble and communities shattered beyond recognition. Nearly the entire population has been forced from their homes, many uprooted multiple times as front lines shift and safe zones disappear. Overcrowded shelters and sprawling tent camps offer little protection from the elements, and families carry what few belongings they have left through streets lined with destruction. Privacy and dignity have become luxuries, as people sleep side by side in cramped, unsanitary conditions, uncertain if they will ever return home. Famine is now a grim reality. More than 200 people, including at least 100 children, have died from malnutrition and dehydration, and the numbers continue to rise. Food and clean water are almost impossible to find, and parents are forced to watch helplessly as their children grow weaker each day. Hospitals, already overwhelmed, are filled with the cries of the hungry and the sick as aid agencies warn that the worst is yet to come. The collapse of aid delivery has led to scenes of desperation and chaos. Crowds gather around the few aid trucks that make it through, risking their lives for a bag of flour or a bottle of water. In the scramble for survival, deadly stampedes have become tragically common, and humanitarian workers struggle to maintain order amid the growing desperation. Gaza's healthcare system is in ruins. Hospitals have been bombed and supplies are depleted. Doctors and nurses work around the clock, often forced to operate without anesthesia or basic medical equipment. Patients lie on floors waiting for care that may never come, while medical staff make impossible choices about who to treat first. Infectious diseases now spread unchecked in the overcrowded shelters and clinics. With sanitation systems destroyed and clean water scarce, even a minor infection can quickly become fatal. Children and the elderly are especially vulnerable, and preventable illnesses claim more lives each day. The psychological toll is immense, especially on children. Many have witnessed the deaths of loved ones, lost their homes, and endured constant fear. Trauma, anxiety, and a deep sense of hopelessness are widespread, with countless children unable to sleep or speak about what they have seen. The scars of this conflict will last a lifetime. Aid workers warn that an entire generation is being shaped by war, carrying deep psychological wounds that will persist for decades. Humanitarian organizations are doing what they can, offering counseling and support, but the need far outstrips the resources available. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is not just a tragic byproduct of war, it has become a defining feature of the current strategy. The suffering of civilians is immense, and the world watches as an entire society is pushed to the brink of collapse, with consequences that will echo for generations to come. Dissent is growing inside Israel's own security and political establishment, as the war in Gaza drags on with no clear end in sight. What began as a unified response to the October 7th attacks has steadily unraveled, revealing deep fractures within the country's leadership and society. IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir has publicly warned that further expansion into Gaza City risks a costly, unwinnable urban war. Military leaders are increasingly vocal about the dangers of a prolonged campaign, cautioning that the army could become bogged down in a conflict with no achievable victory, while Israeli soldiers face mounting casualties and uncertainty. Hostage families desperate for the return of their loved ones argue that only diplomacy, not military escalation, can bring them home. Their voices have grown louder, urging the government to prioritize negotiations over continued fighting, and warning that every day of war puts the hostages' lives at greater risk. Their nightly protests have become a symbol of the human cost of the government's approach. These vigils, often illuminated by candlelight and filled with the faces of missing loved ones, have captured the nation's attention and stirred public debate about the true price of the ongoing conflict. Political opponents accuse Netanyahu of prolonging the war for personal survival, delaying investigations into the failures of October 7, 2023. Critics within the Knesset and on the streets claim that the government is putting political interests above national security, fueling anger and mistrust among the public. Polls show rising public support for a diplomatic deal to end the fighting and free the hostages. More Israelis are questioning whether continued military operations can achieve lasting security, or if a negotiated settlement is the only way forward. The unity forged after the initial attacks has fractured, replaced by deep divisions over the war's purpose and endgame. Heated arguments erupt in public squares and online, as Israelis grapple with conflicting visions for their country's future. Israel is now a nation divided, questioning whether the current path serves its security or its leaders' interests. As the war continues, the debate over its direction grows ever more urgent, leaving the country at a crossroads, torn between fear, hope, and the search for a way out of the crisis. Netanyahu's Gaza strategy faces mounting accusations of violating international law. Human rights groups and legal experts warn that the high civilian death toll, destruction of homes and hospitals, and forced displacement may constitute war crimes. The creation of safe zones and mass evacuations are seen as permanent demographic changes, potentially ethnic cleansing. The blockade and resulting famine violate Israel's obligations under the Geneva Conventions to provide for civilians under occupation. These actions have triggered cases at the International Court of Justice and calls for sanctions and arms embargoes. Even if Israel claims military victory, the shadow of illegality threatens its global legitimacy and relationships with democratic allies. Israel's diplomatic isolation is deepening, with only the US as a major ally, and even that relationship is fraying. Arms embargoes and threats of trade suspensions from Europe signal a dramatic shift with economic and strategic consequences. The IDF, stretched thin after 2 years of mobilization, faces the risk of being bogged down in a costly urban insurgency. Military leaders warn that overreach could weaken Israel's ability to respond to other threats. The plan's biggest flaw: no viable political endgame. By rejecting the Palestinian Authority and failing to offer a credible alternative, the strategy risks chaos, extremism, or permanent occupation. Critics argue that true security requires a political solution, not endless military campaigns. By its own standards, Netanyahu's Gaza strategy is failing. Hamas remains a fighting force, still holding hostages and resisting Israeli control. The humanitarian crisis has worsened, with no stable civilian administration or safe zones. Instead of liberation, Gaza is devastated and dependent on crippled aid systems. Diplomatically, Israel is more isolated than ever, with key alliances fractured and global support for Palestinian statehood rising. The plan ignores the reality that Israeli and Palestinian futures are intertwined. Military force alone cannot deliver lasting security or peace. The verdict from experts and the public alike: the current path is a dead end, costing lives and Israel's reputation. Netanyahu's Gaza strategy has failed to achieve its goals, instead creating a crisis of global proportions. The plan has deepened Israel's security dilemma, fueled regional animosity, and left a humanitarian disaster in its wake. The world, including Israel's allies, now calls for an immediate ceasefire, a surge of humanitarian aid, and a serious diplomatic process. The most widely supported alternative: empower a reformed Palestinian Authority and pursue a two-state solution. Israel and the world stand at a crossroads. One path leads to more conflict and isolation, the other to diplomacy and hope. The global outcry is not an attack on Israel's right to exist, but a plea for a new course before another generation is lost to war.